Today, I hope to address, in part, a recent viral X-post about some shady-looking operations in King County here in Washington State. Now, this is as it applies to using an outside paid corporate organization called Omniballot, where the X-user, and you can see it here, posts an example of how to print a fake ballot on your computer at home and presumably mail it or maybe drop it off at your local auditor's office in King County in this case. Now, I hope to dive into this story a bit deeper and then explain some nuances here for those who actually care about the integrity and the reputation of our election process in Washington State. But before I get into that, I want to remind people to like this video and subscribe to our channel there down below, and then share this video with others if you like it, who might appreciate the content. If you care about these issues, you should know that you're certainly not alone, but our content is often shadow banned or restricted from being viewed by most people because our political establishment tends to coordinate with our big tech friends to ensure that most people do not hear non-governmental approved narratives, and this certainly isn't approved by them. Now, this costs you nothing to share, like, or subscribe to this channel, except for just a few seconds of your time, but we can make an impact, I believe, by exposing the truth and then encouraging a wider, more educated discussion on these topics than what big corporations or our government wants us to ever do. Now, so back to this Omniballot operation in King County and then elsewhere in Washington State. I've actually discussed this topic a bit before in some previous videos, but most of the time I tended to discuss Omniballot because they were involved in a weird kind of this online ballot rehab operation in King County in August of this year, which is currently being litigated in court by a lawsuit that was filed by the Washington State Republican Party against King County elections, which is why it's actually being heard in Snohomish County. Now, this appears to, what this is about is that King County was allowing a remote online kind of finger swipe by apparently unverified people, meaning nobody really knows who actually did the finger swipe to rehab the ballots, which were apparently voted without signatures or with unverifiable signatures during the August primary just a few months ago. Now, apparently, there were thousands of these examples in just King County alone. And this mattered because it was also noticed generally because there was a super close election in the statewide office of Public Lands Commissioner, where the Republicans came 49 votes away from actually having 2 Republicans in the final election out of 1.9 million votes that were actually counted. Now, that is actually a shockingly narrow margin, and in close elections like this, the little things do tend to matter quite a bit. So it turns out that this secretive Omniballot operation was not as little as anyone at first thought. Now, that litigation, which is currently here in Snohomish County Superior Court under court case number 24-2-06945-31, anybody can log on to the Snohomish County courts and see this case for themselves because this is a public record. However, that litigation, while different than this recent X-post, it still highlights other recent concerns when it comes to election integrity and kind of this lack of audibility for some types of election activity. And then a concerning trend, of course, were local auditors and the Washington State Secretary of State. They just seem determined and obsessed to make the election process less transparent, less open, less understandable, and more confusing than ever before. And then, of course, if you dare to get into the weeds and actually try to work on policy or transparency fixes, the Seattle Times, King 5 News, our AG Bob Ferguson, and all the other government narrative mouthpieces, they end up working just overtime to accuse you of being an election denier for trying to put a spotlight on the processes that are involved. Now, remember, you're no longer allowed to question authority anymore unless Trump is president. I guess we'll find out. Now, anyway, with this litigation about the Omniballot operation in court based on some shady and questionable King County Elections Department activity, this recent X-post about using that same company's website to create essentially fake or false ballots, it raises further red flags for anyone who actually cares about our elections in Washington State. Now, obviously, it doesn't concern the people who support Venezuelan-style election systems, like so many on the left tend to support today, but for those of us who actually want more transparency, this clearly raises concerns. Now, first, I want to clarify a couple of genuine facts, which might be ugly or they might even be issues about which many people are in denial, but they're true nonetheless. First, yes, it is actually true that anyone can write their ballots or their votes on toilet paper and then submit them to your local auditor's office, and they must accept those votes as being legitimate. At least this is true in theory and in law. Now, this was based on a stupid and foolish law that was kind of passed a few years ago to muddy the waters and make elections less transparent under the pretense of making elections more accessible. Now, I add the qualifier here in theory. It's only because I'm actually not aware of anyone truly doing this yet. And I'm sure if anyone does this, it's going to raise genuine problems of signature verification and will exponentially cause drama and problems in the elections department, even if it is technically legal. So compared to that legal scenario, using a shady leftist kind of third-party corporate vendor to print out your ballot at home or anywhere else, and then calling it legal, it's not apparently on first blush illegal. Now, it probably should be illegal because of the obvious opportunity for abuse, fraud, and manipulation, which everyone in power who's currently been elected by this process denies is a problem. However, at this point in time, the ex-user who posted this clip is correct about that aspect of this kind of wonkish issue. However, there is one theoretical constraint, apparently not addressed in this initial X post here, and this theoretical constraint has to do with voter registration. Now, you could basically indeed print a ballot just this way, but your ballot goes nowhere if it isn't attached to a voter registration. And in theory, your ballot envelope or basically the printed paper with the standard envelope disclaimer, that would need to be signed. And again, in theory, your signature on that piece of paper would have to match a signature on file for that voter registration. So again, in theory, as I'm sure King County elections and the Washington State Secretary of State will claim, a fake printed ballot that isn't attached to a theoretically real registered voter would be rejected. Now, I'm not sure what the true number of rejected ballots received in this manner really is on any given election cycle. I'm actually not aware of any big numbers. How many of them are rejected every year? I really don't know. But I'd encourage those who care about fair, honest, transparent, and open elections. I'd suggest that this is actually kind of a good category of public records to request from your local auditor's office. How many ballots are rejected for this very reason? There must be a number somewhere in the labyrinth of the Leviathan at your auditor's office. Now, listen, when I'm discussing this topic with election observers over the past 4 to 6 years generally, I also find that there's many concerns about these online ballots. And now, of course, the home-printed, home-brew version of these ballots. But to be fair, the number of ballots that have received that kind of fall into this category over the years, they've really not historically been that large. It is gradually increasing. However, this is just no excuse to not resolve any problems that exist with the scheme right now. It may be small today, but all pandemics start small before they grow, so even numerically small problems should be addressed now before they become just much bigger problems and they metastasize into some full-blown fiasco in the near future. Now, one of the problems that we clearly uncovered across Washington State and many other states where the voter rolls are getting a bit more scrutiny is that there's a lot of basically crufty voter rolls, registered voters, on the voter rolls who really no longer live where they claim, maybe some who never lived there at all, and then some of which have no explanation for whether they exist or not. It is actually stunning how little concern there is about this problem from our political establishment, who appear to benefit from the problem or from their tame media, of course. They don't want to look either. But here's where that concern tends to overlap, I believe, with this recent X post. If somebody has a decent list of these unknown or non-existent or inactive voters, and they suddenly receive many of these theoretical voters who are printing out their ballots, and then these printed ballots suddenly appear in various elections departments around the state, what will they do? I doubt that there's any curiosity left in the bureaucracy to question the results of any election unless, of course, Trump wins. Or maybe when tax-cutting initiatives pass, perhaps then. But it would be interesting if these bureaucrats could be convinced to care about election integrity for perhaps the first time in their career and not just protecting their facade narrative that nothing can possibly go wrong no matter what. Now, it would be a terrible thing if some shady organization or loose affiliation of people registered a few 100,000 fake voters at all these homeless service locations around the state, just like the one used by this ex-user in the recent post. Or maybe even if they just early voted the inactive voters in the same manner and then produced results that nobody would anticipate. Perhaps like a Trump victory in Washington state, or maybe a Republican mayor in Seattle, or just some other unexpected outcome like that. Now, maybe if that happened, a bunch of the current election integrity deniers would suddenly wake up from their induced coma and discover the need to restore credibility and transparency in elections as maybe one of their priorities once again. Now, obviously, this raises a concern that I brought up in the past. If you think your vote doesn't count or doesn't matter, you're wrong. Someone else can, under this current system, vote on your behalf and make sure it matters to somebody else. And that probably will be the last person that you'd support if you actually spent maybe 5 minutes and then voted, rather than pretend that your failure to vote is some kind of imaginary stand on some kind of principle. For no other reason, just vote to block that type of bad outcome. Now, secondly, if you are an election observer this year, please pay attention. And thank you for taking the time to do this. And don't sit back like the invisible wallflower asleep in the corner, seeing nothing. Please pay attention to what is happening in your county offices, particularly in places like Spokane, King, Thurston, Pierce, Snohomish, Clark, and Whatcom, of course, because issues have oftentimes been raised in these locations in the past. And also pay attention to San Juan, Jefferson, Clallam, and Yakima. I mean, really every county in the state. Your job is more important than you realize, and even the little things that don't make sense could uncover some real problems. Now, finally, there is a very necessary requirement for all of us to recognize that the days where government and their kind of tamed media spokespeople like the Seattle Times or King 5 News or Spokesman Review and others, they have to stop their obsession with protecting the government's narrative for a change and perhaps start investigating the truth once again. Now, I realize that it's been decades since real acts of journalism have been conducted or committed by these organizations and most of the rest of the kind of collapsing local legacy media. But getting back to questioning authority and speaking the truth in our communities, in our state, and perhaps even in our nation, that has to be a priority for regular people at some point in time. I mean, no issue that I've ever worked on in the last 15 years has generated such weird media bias, personal threats, and denial of reality than simple, wonkish questions about improving the election process. Now, granted, the only way I suspect any of these corporations that once were considered journalism entities of some kind will ever actually dig into this issue again will be only if Trump wins or if they just don't like the outcome of an election. But until then, it is up to you and I and many other regular people to actually seek the truth. We won't always get it right. It's part because of the kind of shocking effort to just conceal everything now and then threaten those of us who actually dare to ask the questions. But we must continue to seek out the truth, regardless of the obstacles they put in front of us. Now, in closing, I want to put some of the more wonkish election integrity conversations in context today. Back in 2011, which is really when I first became interested in this issue, it was after I experienced very weird doorbelling anomalies in the voter rolls in Thurston County when I actually ran for office there in 2010. I couldn't fill a kitchen table in 2011 with people in our state who actually cared. Really, it was just a handful of people. Over the years, I would occasionally find somebody with information about some of the more wonkish elements of the election process, and I became really pretty excited in early 2020 when I finally found some local people willing to look at, say, the NCOA update lists, and I could start, that's the National Change of Address update list for the post office, and I could actually start to quantify my concerns with bad voter roll data in King County, for example. But the national chaos of the 2020 election suddenly introduced a massive level of interest in the subject, which probably hadn't existed, in my opinion, at least since the 2000 Bush v. Gore hanging Chad fiasco 24 years ago, if you can even remember that far back. I wish many of these issues had been adequately addressed back then. For the first time in my lifetime, though, right now, there are actually large teams of people watching closely, not just in our state and not just in a little team here and there, but all around the country. For the first time in a generation, I believe a large plurality of voters and citizens are actually interested in the often opaque and purposely archaic, creaky process of kind of running elections. I think this is a good thing. uncovering problems, bad policy, sketchy operations, and then generating the public support to pay attention and fix those problems that are inevitably uncovered. This is a good thing, and it's actually quite new. Now, it may not be a good thing to those who prefer to live and operate in the shadows. Lazy bureaucrats, shady grifting operations who profit from the confusion, or for those who get paid to kind of protect the government's narrative and who apparently profit from covering up bad behavior. May not be good for them, but for everyone else, exposing the truth is certainly a good thing. It can be messy, it can be obnoxious, absurd, and then crazy at times. But in the end, if we just keep grinding away at the problems and inspiring more people to engage, I think we can find solutions or paths out of the mess that we uncover. It isn't perfect, and utopia will never exist on this earth, no matter how hard you try, but we can make improvements. However, it means that you have to show up to make a difference. No voting as some type of virtue signaling statement to your friends. It only helps encourage more bad and corrupt behavior. So I think this recent X post is a reminder of how that could happen. Government will never and has never fixed itself or cleaned up its own messes. We must show up to change anything, because the future belongs to those who show up.